You've been calling it the wrong thing. That thing you carry around, the archive of everything that didn't work, didn't land, didn't go the way you needed it to go. The business that collapsed, the relationship that ended badly and publicly. The year you look back on and wince. The version of yourself you spent considerable energy trying to explain away to people who didn't ask. You've been calling that a burden, a liability, evidence of something fundamentally flawed in your wiring. That's the part that I find genuinely funny. Not in the way that people laugh when something is light, in the way that people laugh when they finally see the punchline they've been standing inside the whole time. You've been treating your most valuable asset like a wound. You've been hiding the exact thing that makes you dangerous. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this before your brain reaches for the comfortable answer. Who would you rather face in a room? Someone who has never lost anything, who has glided from one polished success to the next on a surface that never had any friction, or someone who has failed specifically, failed in ways that cost them something real, failed repeatedly, learned the lesson in the expensive way, and is still here. You know the answer. You've always known the answer. The person who has never lost badly doesn't know what they don't know. They have confidence, yes, the specific, fragile kind of confidence that has never been tested at a temperature that would tell you anything useful. That confidence is not a weapon, it's decoration. And the person who has lost, who has stood in the wreckage of something they built and had to decide what to do next with the actual pieces, that person is a different instrument entirely. The dark is where you were trained. You just haven't been told what you are being trained for yet. Here is how the story goes. And I want you to notice, as I tell it, how precisely it fits. It started early. You tried something, and it didn't work. And the people around you, parents, teachers, peers, the whole ambient chorus of other people's opinions, responded in a way that wrote a rule. The rule was something like, failure is a verdict, not an event, not a data point, a verdict on you, specifically as a person, permanently. And because you were young, and because the people saying it held authority over things you needed, you believed them. You filed it away as fact. And then it happened again. A different thing, a different failure, but the same mechanism. And this time you were faster to apply the verdict yourself because you'd already been taught the logic. By the third or fourth time, you didn't even need an audience. You had learned to do it yourself, preemptively, before the event was finished. You had internalized the judge so thoroughly that you carried a courtroom inside your chest and ran every attempt through it before you began. That's the actual damage, not the failure. The court, because the court never closes, and its docket is always full. Every time you consider doing something new, something that might not work, something that doesn't come with a guarantee, the court convenes. The verdict is usually the same. The prosecution always brings the same evidence, the previous failures, the full catalog, every exhibit labeled and dated and arranged in the order most designed to make the conclusion feel inevitable. And you sit in that courtroom and you listen. Every time. You know the internal monologue. I can hear it from here. It sounds like, why would this be different? It sounds like last time I tried something like this. It sounds like I'm not the kind of person which is the most elegant lie of them all, because kind of person implies that the category is fixed, that you were born into it, that no amount of evidence to the contrary will be admitted. The monologue is incredibly detailed, specific. It knows the exact case studies. It has timestamps. It quotes directly from the record, and the reason it knows so much is that you gave it everything it needed to build the case. Every time you sat with a failure long enough to call it something permanent rather than something that happened, you handed the prosecution another document. Now, here is the part that is genuinely interesting, not comforting, interesting. Because there is a version of this story in which everything I just described is not the tragedy. It is the setup. The mistakes you made, the specific ones, the ones with real cost attached. They don't exist in any book you could have read before you made them. You can't study your way into the knowledge a real failure gives you. There are certain things you simply cannot know until the thing collapses in your hands and you are holding the pieces and deciding what they actually are. That knowledge, sharp-edged, expansive, earned in a room where nobody wanted to be, that knowledge has a specific weight that borrowed knowledge does not. I once knew someone, tremendously earnest individual, very invested in never being wrong, who had devised an extremely elaborate system for avoiding failure. Exhaustive preparation, contingency, inside contingency. The whole architecture of someone who found the possibility of being caught making a mistake genuinely intolerable. And what he produced, for all that architecture, was a very impressive series of things that stayed safe. Things that worked, technically, because they were never asked to do anything that might not work. He called it diligence. I thought it looked more like a very sophisticated refusal to find out what he was actually made of. So I'll ask you the question you've been not asking yourself, underneath the whole performance of taking your failures personally. What did they teach you that nothing else could have? Not as a consolation. Not as a reframe designed to make you feel better about it. As a genuine audit, what do you now know? Specifically, precisely, in your body and your judgment and your instincts, that you could only know because the thing went wrong? That answer is not a silver lining. That answer is the asset. They call it a failure record. That phrase, failure record. As if your history of things that didn't work is a criminal file. Something that follows you. Something that follows you. Something prospective employers and cautious people will pull up and use to assess your risk profile. The language itself is doing something to you, and it is doing it quietly, which is how language does its best damage. A record implies permanence. It implies that what happened is static, filed, closed, final. But a failure is not a record. A failure is a result. Results contain information. Information is directional. It tells you something about where to go next, what to adjust, what variable was wrong. A result, even a very bad result, is the most honest thing that will ever happen to you. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't perform. It shows you exactly what was there and exactly what it produced when it met reality. The people who treat their failures as records are afraid of the information. They file a result under verdict because looking at it as data would require them to engage with it directly. And engaging with it directly means they might have to try again differently, which means they might fail again differently, which means they might fail again differently. And they are not sure they can afford that. So the result becomes a verdict. The verdict becomes an identity, and the identity becomes a cage that they built themselves and call fate. You did not fail. You ran an experiment. The experiment gave you results. The results are yours. What you do with them is the only question worth asking. A result that costs you something is the only result you'll remember precisely enough to use. Here's where this belief actually comes from. And I want to be clear that understanding the origin is not the same as excusing the behavior. Understanding it is just more useful than not understanding it. The idea that failure is shameful is not a natural conclusion. It is a taught conclusion. It was taught specifically because it is useful to the people who benefit from you being afraid to fail. An education system that grades on a curve and hangs the grades on the wall is not trying to help you learn. It is trying to produce compliance through the management of social humiliation. An economy that celebrates overnight success stories while quietly burying the decade of attempts that preceded them is not giving you an accurate picture of how anything actually works. It is managing your expectations in a direction that serves its own purposes. The shame around failure is manufactured, not by any single conspiracy, by the accumulated weight of systems that needed you to conflate performing successfully with being valuable. Because a person who knows their value is not contingent on their output is considerably harder to manage. The people who are genuinely dangerous in any field, in any domain, at any level, are the people who separated those two things, who stopped making their identity a hostage to their results. Not because they don't care about results, they care intensely, but because they know the difference between a bad result and a bad self, and they do not allow the cord inside their chest to confuse the two. Shame around failure is a product someone sold you. It is not a truth. Point 3. Turn the lens. On the judges, let's look at the people who look at your history of failures and use it against you, who bring it up in the wrong tone, who reference that one thing, that specific thing, the one with the most embarrassing details when they need to remind you of something. What does that tell you about them? A person who is genuinely doing their own difficult work does not have enough available attention to maintain a highlight reel of your stumbles. They're busy. They're in the middle of something. They're dealing with their own experiments and their own results, and they do not have the bandwidth to compile your failures into ammunition. The people who catalog your failures are not doing it from a position of success. They are doing it from a position of safety, which is to say, a position of stillness, a position of not trying, a position of watching from a sufficient distance that nothing can reach them. And what you represent specifically is a problem. Because you tried, because you were visible enough to fail publicly, because you chose the kind of life that generates real results. Some of them bad, instead of the kind of life that generates no results at all, because no real decisions were ever made. You know, there is a specific type of person I've encountered, very serious about their own reputation. Very serious about their own reputation. Deeply invested in the image of someone who does not make mistakes. Who had this remarkable quality of appearing precisely when something had already gone wrong. Making the minimum adjustment required to associate themselves with the recovery, and then positioning the whole sequence as evidence of their judgment. Never the one who tried first. Always the one who arrived after the wreckage to explain what should have been done differently. He was very good at that. Excellent hindsight. Zero scar tissue. I always found the precision of the timing just a touch too convenient to be called wisdom. The people who judge your failures have negotiated a private arrangement with their own inaction, and your visibility threatens the terms. Point 4. 4. Name the concrete advantage. Here is the specific, tangible, non-metaphorical advantage that your history of failures gives you over the people who haven't accumulated the same record. You know what the inside of the worst case scenario looks like? Not theoretically. Actually, you've been in the room when things fell apart and you didn't stop existing. You made decisions in conditions of genuine uncertainty and real stakes, and some of those decisions were wrong, and you survived the wrongness, and you calibrated. This means that your risk assessment is accurate in a way that untested judgment never can be. When you evaluate a new situation, you are not working from models and projections and optimistic assumptions about how things tend to go. You are working from actual data. The fear response you have around certain patterns, that specific tightness, that particular signal is a calibrated instrument. It is not your enemy. It is a system that was built in conditions your competitors have not experienced. The person who has failed specifically knows two things that the person who hasn't cannot know: what the actual cost of failure is, not the imagined, feared, catastrophized version, but the real cost. And the fact that they survived it, both pieces of that, are useful. The first corrects overestimation of risk. The second corrects underestimation of resilience. Together, they produce a person who can make decisions in the dark without freezing, because they have already been in the dark and they know what they found there. Your scar tissue is competitive intelligence. Nobody else paid the price to acquire. Point 5. Distinguish between misuse and ownership. There is a version of T. His that goes wrong, and I would be doing you a disservice not to name it. A failure that is owned, examined, learned from, filed as data, becomes an asset. A failure that is merely survived, endured, avoided in memory, buried under enough forward motion that you don't have to look at it directly, becomes a weight you carry without knowing it's there. And the second kind will eventually show up in your decisions in ways you don't recognize as its influence. The difference is not in the experience. The experience is the same. The difference is whether you went back in and did the audit. Whether you sat with the specific, uncomfortable question of what actually went wrong. Not in the version of events that is most flattering to you, but in the version that is most accurate. The version where you account for your own errors, not just the circumstances and the other people and the timing. Ownership of a failure means being willing to hold the information it gave you, even the information about yourself, especially the information about yourself, because that's where the real calibration happens. Not in the external lessons. Don't work with people like that again. Don't start without this resource again, but in the internal ones. I ignored the signal I felt in week 2. I prioritized looking in control over asking the question I needed to ask. I was not honest about what I didn't know. That level of accounting is uncomfortable. It is also the only level that produces genuine forward correction. The failure you refuse to audit owns you. The one you examine becomes yours. Stop using the phrase, my failures. It is a possessive that functions as an indictment. The word failure should be replaced in your internal vocabulary with evidence, not to soften it. The evidence can be brutal, but because evidence implies that the information belongs to a case that is still being made, not a case that has been closed. Evidence is directional. Evidence is directional. Evidence is usable. Evidence does not define, it informs. And stop saying I failed at, and replace it with I learned at a cost. The cost was real. You don't need to minimize it. But learning at a cost is categorically different from failing, because one is a terminus and the other is a position in an ongoing sequence. One ends a sentence, the other continues it. The language shift is not about positivity. It is about accuracy. Failure is actually the less precise word. What happened is that you ran an attempt. The attempt produced information you didn't previously have, and the information cost you something. That is the actual sentence. The word failure is a shorthand that throws away most of the data. Replace it with the full sentence, even when a full sentence is hard to say. Identify the rooms, the relationships, the recurring conversations, the specific environments in which your history of failures is used as a definition rather than as a detail. And be precise about what those rooms are actually doing to your decision-making. There is a specific kind of room where the past is weaponized, where someone in the room benefits from you not trying the next thing, because if you try the next thing, and it works, something about the current arrangement changes, identify that room. Name the mechanism. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to leave dramatically, but you have to stop walking into it without knowing what you're walking into. And you have to stop treating its opinion of your past as authoritative. There is also a kind of room you may be avoiding that you shouldn't be. The room with people who have failed more than you and further than you and are still going. Those rooms are harder to find. They are not the rooms that get the most attention or the most social proof, but they contain people who know the difference between an event and a verdict. And being around people who know that difference has a specific effect on your internal court that is difficult to replicate any other way. The next time someone uses your past against you, brings it up in the wrong tone, in the wrong context, for the wrong reasons, here are the 2 sentences you say internally. You don't owe anyone the external version. That information belongs to me, and it is already in use. Not defensive, not explanatory. Certain. The certainty does not come from having a rebuttal. It comes from the private knowledge of what the failures actually built, the specific calibration, the specific resilience, the specific intelligence that was purchased at the cost of those experiences. That knowledge is yours. The person using your past against you does not have access to what it actually produced. They saw the collapse. They don't know what you built from the rubble, in the room, after, when nobody was watching. You are not in the business of explaining your construction process to people who showed up for the demolition and missed the rebuild. This is the posture, not a goal, not an aspiration, a ground to occupy, beginning now, in whatever form you can manage today. The ownership statement is this. The history is yours. All of it. The good results and the bad results and the bad results and the failed attempts and the costly experiments. You do not curate it for external audiences by hiding the parts that look bad. You do not apologize for the parts that made you who you are. You do not pretend the failures didn't happen in order to appear more credible to people whose credibility you don't actually need. The full history, including the parts you're still a little embarrassed about, is the source material for everything you are capable of doing next. It is a training record of someone who has been tested in conditions that have not been available to everyone. It is, if you are willing to read it correctly, not a liability. Not a liability. It is a curriculum. You are not someone who has failed. You are someone who has gathered evidence at significant personal cost and has not yet stopped gathering. That is a different sentence. That is a different person. And that person does not need to defend their history to anyone. The history speaks. What it says depends entirely on whether you're willing to translate it honestly. Here is the larger pattern. The one operating underneath everything we've talked about. The world has a very specific use for your shame around failure. It is not accidental and it is not incidental. A person who is ashamed of their past attempts is a person who is manageable, who stays inside the boundaries established by their previous results. Who does not try things that might not work? Who requires permission and social proof and precedent before moving? That person is predictable. They occupy a known quantity of space. They do not disrupt anything because disruption requires the willingness to be wrong in public, and they have already decided they cannot afford that. The system was not built for people who fail forward. It was built for people who don't, who stay in the designated lanes, who leverage their fear of visible failure as a management tool applied to themselves. The system is deeply comfortable with the idea that your history is a verdict, because a person who believes their history is a verdict stays in the designated territory of what the verdict allows. You are not in the designated territory. You haven't been for a while. The fact that you're here listening to this means you already know something is wrong with the verdict. You've been carrying the weight of it, yes, but you haven't stopped moving, which means you already know some. Here below the place you're willing to admit it consciously that the verdict is not final. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You have survived specific failures that would have stopped other people. Not because you're braver, because you didn't have the option of a clean retreat. You have information in your body, in your instincts, in your risk perception and your pattern recognition that was purchased at prices your untested competitors didn't have to pay. And you have been treating all of that as something to apologize for, which is, and I say this with the specific amusement of someone who finds it genuinely absurd, the most expensive mistake you've made so far. The people who are most dangerous in any arena, the ones who produce the work that actually changes something, are almost never the ones with the cleanest records. They are the ones who accumulated the most expensive education available. The kind you only get when something real is at stake. When you make the decision and live with what it produces. When you find out in the actual conditions of the actual world what you are made of. You know what you're made of. Not entirely. There is always more to find out. But more than you did before each of the things that went wrong. That knowledge is in you now. It doesn't leave. It doesn't expire. It is specifically, permanently, irreversibly yours. Your past is not the problem. Your past is the qualification. Go use it.